The stone carvers of Copán worked through the night, their copper chisels striking limestone in rhythmic patterns that had echoed through the valley for 600 years. They were creating what would become Altar L, commissioned by King Ukit Tuk in the year 822 of the Common Era, though they could not have known this would be among the last great monuments their civilization would ever produce. The hieroglyphs they carved spoke of divine mandate and celestial cycles, of the king's connection to the gods and his power over rain and harvest, yet outside the workshop, the great city was already showing signs of the catastrophe that would soon silence these stones forever. In those final decades of the 9th century, Copán still appeared magnificent to any observer. The city's acropolis rose above the Copán River valley in a series of pyramids, palaces, and courtyards that housed perhaps 28,000 souls within the urban core, with many more scattered across the surrounding valley. The hieroglyphic stairway, containing the longest Maya text ever discovered, proclaimed the glory of 16 kings across more than 2,000 individual glyphs. Ball courts hosted ritual games where players embodied the eternal struggle between the forces of creation and destruction, their movements watched by crowds who believed these contests helped maintain cosmic order. The sophistication of urban life in Copán matched anything found in contemporary cities across the globe. Astronomical observations enabled priests to predict eclipses years in advance, while mathematicians employed the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in European thought. The city's workshops produced elaborate jade ornaments, obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical steel, and polychrome pottery depicting scenes from mythology and daily life with extraordinary artistic skill. Scribes maintained libraries of bark paper books containing histories, astronomical tables, and religious texts that represented accumulated knowledge from centuries of observation and contemplation. Yet beneath this veneer of cultural achievement, troubling signs had been accumulating for generations. The valley's population had swelled to perhaps 150,000 people by the early 9th century, a density that pushed agricultural systems to their absolute limits. Every available piece of arable land had been converted to cultivation, including steep hillsides that required extensive terracing to prevent erosion. The forests that once covered the surrounding mountains had been cleared not just for farmland, but for the limestone burning that produced the plaster coating every surface of the city's monumental architecture. The interconnected nature of Maya civilization meant that Copán's struggles were not occurring in isolation. Across the lowlands, from the Usumacinta River drainage to the heart of the Petén rainforest, dozens of major cities and hundreds of smaller centers were experiencing similar pressures. These were not isolated city-states, but parts of an integrated network bound together by kinship, ties between royal families, shared religious beliefs, common writing systems, and extensive trade relationships that moved goods across hundreds of miles of challenging terrain. Tikal, perhaps the most powerful of all Maya cities, controlled a domain of nearly 2,000 square kilometers at its height. Its population of approximately 100,000 people depended on an elaborate system of reservoirs and canals to capture and store rainwater during the wet season for use during the annual drought. The city's 6 great pyramid temples, the tallest reaching over 200 feet into the jungle canopy, served as both religious centers and symbols of royal power that could be seen from miles away. The maintenance of these structures alone required enormous resources, with constant replastering and repainting necessary to combat the deteriorating effects of tropical humidity. Palenque, nestled against the mountains of Chiapas, had developed perhaps the most sophisticated architectural and engineering techniques in the Maya world. The city's palace featured a unique 4-story tower that may have served as an astronomical observatory, while the Temple of the Inscriptions contained the elaborate tomb of King Tikal, whose reign of 68 years had brought the city to its greatest glory. The aqueduct system that channeled the Otulam River beneath the city's main plaza represented engineering expertise that would not be matched in the region for centuries after the collapse. Calakmul, Tikal's great rival in the central lowlands, commanded a network of allied cities that at various times challenged Tikal's hegemony over the region. The competition between these superpowers drove much of the political history of the Classic period, with smaller cities forced to choose sides in conflicts that could result in their elevation or destruction. The massive pyramids of Calakmul, still being uncovered from beneath centuries of jungle growth, contained elaborate tomb paintings depicting the cosmos as the Maya understood it, with the world tree connecting the underworld, the earthly realm, and the 13 levels of heaven. The complexity of relationships between these urban centers created a web of mutual dependencies that would prove catastrophic when systems began to fail. Trade routes that had operated for centuries connected the salt works of the northern coast with the jade sources of the Guatemalan highlands, the obsidian deposits of the Mexican plateau with the cacao groves of the Pacific Piedmont. Luxury goods like quetzal feathers, jaguar pelts, and marine shells moved along these networks, but so did basic necessities like corn, beans, and ceramic vessels for storing and preparing food. Each major city maintained its own calendar specialists who tracked multiple concurrent cycles of time, from the 260-day ritual calendar to the 365-day solar year to the long count that measured days from a mythological starting point in 3114 BCE. This shared temporal framework enabled coordinated activities across vast distances, from agricultural planning to the timing of military campaigns to the scheduling of religious ceremonies that required participation from multiple cities. The precision of these calculations, accurate to within minutes over centuries, demonstrates mathematical sophistication that rivaled any contemporary civilization. The first signs of systemic stress appeared not in the grand capitals, but in the secondary centers that depended on them for protection and trade access. Sites like Dos Pilas and Aguateca in the Petex Batun region showed evidence of hasty defensive constructions in their final years, with walls built from stones pulled from ceremonial buildings, suggesting desperate attempts to fortify against threats that ultimately proved insurmountable. The quality of pottery and other crafts declined noticeably, with the elaborate polychrome designs of earlier periods replaced by simpler, more utilitarian forms. Agricultural yields had been declining gradually for decades before the final collapse. Pollen samples from lake cores across the region show a marked decrease in maize pollen and an increase in weeds, typical of abandoned fields beginning around 750 CE. The practice of slash-and-burn agriculture, sustainable when population densities were low and fields could lie fallow for decades between uses, became increasingly destructive as shortened fallow periods prevented forest regeneration. Soil nutrients depleted rapidly under continuous cultivation, while erosion carried away topsoil that had accumulated over millennia. The response to agricultural stress varied by region but generally involved intensification rather than innovation. Raised field systems in wetland areas, terracing on hillsides, and the construction of check dams to capture sediment all represented attempts to squeeze more productivity from increasingly marginal lands. These labor-intensive solutions required coordination and coercion that placed additional demands on political systems already strained by other challenges. The corvée labor required for these projects took farmers away from their own fields, creating a feedback loop that worsened food security. Trade relationships that had been mutually beneficial began to break down as resources became scarcer. The flow of obsidian from highland sources decreased noticeably in the 8th century, forcing many communities to rely on lower quality chert for tool production. Salt, essential for preserving food in the tropical climate, became increasingly expensive as coastal production centers struggled with their own environmental challenges. The prestige goods that rulers required to maintain their status and reward followers became harder to obtain, weakening the bonds that held political coalitions together. The role of divine kingship in Maya society meant that environmental and economic stresses quickly became crises of political legitimacy. Kings claimed to be intermediaries between the human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that ensured regular rainfall, abundant harvests, and protection from natural disasters. When these claims proved hollow in the face of extended droughts and failing crops, the ideological foundation of royal authority crumbled. The elaborate rituals that had reinforced social hierarchy for centuries began to lose their power to command obedience. Evidence from the final dated monuments at various sites reveals an increasingly desperate tone in royal proclamations. Where earlier inscriptions confidently proclaimed military victories and divine favor, later texts often focus on genealogical claims and appeals to ancient precedent, suggesting rulers struggling to maintain authority through traditional legitimacy rather than demonstrated success. The frequency of monument dedication decreased markedly after 800 CE, with many sites that had erected new stelae every 5 or 10 years falling silent for decades before their final inscriptions. The capture and sacrifice of rival kings, long a feature of Maya warfare, intensified in the late 8th century. The famous murals of Bonampak depict the torture and execution of captives in graphic detail, while inscriptions from multiple sites record the capture of increasingly high-ranking nobles. This escalation of elite conflict diverted resources from productive activities, while eliminating the leadership class that might have coordinated responses to environmental and economic challenges. The destruction of royal lineages through warfare removed the institutional memory necessary for maintaining complex administrative systems. Patterns of ceramic production and distribution suggest that specialized craft production began breaking down decades before the final abandonment of cities. The distinctive pottery styles that had marked regional identities for centuries became increasingly homogenized, while the technical quality of ceramics declined noticeably. This standardization and simplification indicates the collapse of the workshop systems that had produced luxury goods for elite consumption, another sign of the weakening economic networks that sustained urban life. The rainforest that had sustained Maya civilization for over a millennium was dying by degrees, its destruction so gradual that those living through it might not have perceived the magnitude of change within a single lifetime. Where once stood towering ceiba trees reaching 200 feet into the canopy, their buttressed roots sheltering jaguar and tapir, now stretched endless fields of maize interspersed with patches of secondary growth that never reached the majesty of the primary forest. The great trees had been felled not in a single catastrophic clearing, but through generations of incremental expansion, each family claiming just a little more land, each king demanding just a few more temple platforms, until the accumulated impact transformed an entire landscape. The mathematics of feeding 15 million people in what had been tropical rainforest reveals the extraordinary achievement and ultimate impossibility of classic Maya agriculture. A single family of 5 required approximately 2 hectares of land under cultivation to meet their annual maize requirements, assuming average yields and no crop failures. With traditional slash-and-burn techniques, this same family needed access to 20 hectares total, allowing for the lengthy fallow periods necessary for forest regeneration and soil recovery. Simple multiplication demonstrates that 15 million people would have required 300 million hectares under this traditional system, far exceeding the approximately 10 million hectares of the entire Maya lowlands. The solution to this mathematical impossibility had been agricultural intensification on a scale that fundamentally altered the ecological foundations of the region. Fallow periods that should have lasted 20 years were reduced to 5 or even 3 years in densely populated areas. Fields that had once produced 80 bushels of maize per hectare in their first year of cultivation now yielded perhaps 30 bushels after multiple cycles of shortened fallows. The nutritional content of the maize itself declined as soil micronutrients were depleted, producing calories but lacking the trace elements necessary for human health. Phosphorus depletion emerged as a critical limiting factor that no amount of labor investment could overcome. Unlike nitrogen, which could be partially restored through the growth of leguminous plants during fallow periods, phosphorus existed in finite quantities in lowland soils. Each harvest removed phosphorus from the system, carried away in the grain that fed urban populations who deposited their waste in locations from which it would never return to agricultural fields. The gradual mining of this essential nutrient created a slow-motion crisis that manifested as declining yields even when rainfall was adequate and labor abundant. The evidence for this agricultural deterioration appears clearly in lake sediments throughout the Maya region. Core samples from Lake Salpetin reveal distinct changes in pollen assemblages over time, with the ratio of maize to forest pollen increasing steadily through the 7th and 8th centuries before dropping precipitously in the 9th. These same sediments show massive increases in erosion rates, with clay and silt deposition increasing by factors of 5 to 10 times natural background rates. The soils that had developed over thousands of years were washing into lakes and rivers within decades of forest clearing. Ancient Maya farmers understood soil management at a sophisticated level, developing numerous techniques to combat degradation. They constructed elaborate systems of terraces that followed natural contours, built check dams across gullies to capture eroding sediment, and created raised fields in wetland areas that combined drainage with nutrient accumulation. Yet these innovations required constant maintenance and could only slow, not stop, the fundamental depletion occurring across the landscape. Each terrace wall that collapsed during the rainy season, each check dam that filled with sediment, represented accumulated environmental debt that would eventually demand payment. The cultivation of ramon trees, whose protein-rich nuts could supplement maize-based diets, provided partial mitigation but came with its own limitations. These trees required 12 to 15 years to begin producing significant yields and reached peak production only after 25 years. The long-term investment they represented proved incompatible with the immediate needs of growing populations and the political instability that characterized the late Classic period. Many of the ramon orchards that had been carefully maintained for generations were cut down for fuelwood or cleared for maize fields as short-term pressures overwhelmed long-term planning. Root crops like manioc and sweet potato, which could grow in degraded soils unsuitable for maize, became increasingly important in household gardens, but could never match the caloric productivity or cultural significance of corn. The Maya creation myth itself centered on maize, with humans formed from corn dough by the gods. The psychological and cultural impact of declining corn yields thus extended far beyond simple nutrition, striking at the heart of Maya identity and cosmology. Rulers who could not ensure abundant corn harvests failed in their most fundamental duty to their people. Water management presented challenges that grew more severe as deforestation altered regional hydrology. The removal of forest cover changed precipitation patterns, with rainfall becoming more irregular and intense. Where forest canopy had once intercepted rain and allowed gradual percolation into soil, cleared fields experienced rapid runoff that carved deep gullies and carried away topsoil. The sophisticated reservoir systems that cities had constructed to capture rainwater found themselves alternately overwhelmed by flood events and insufficient during extended dry periods. Tikal's reservoir system exemplified both the ingenuity and ultimate limitations of Maya water management. The city's 13 reservoirs could hold over 900,000 cubic meters of water when full, enough to supply the urban population for several months without rain. The reservoirs were sealed with clay imported from distant sources and connected by channels that allowed water to be moved between them as needed. Silt traps prevented rapid filling with sediment, while planted margins may have helped purify water through biological filtration. Yet this elaborate system depended on regular rainfall patterns that began to fail in the 8th century. Sediment cores from the reservoirs show increasing evidence of algae blooms associated with stagnant water and high nutrient loads from human and animal waste. The appearance of toxic cyanobacteria, identified through biochemical markers in reservoir sediments, suggests that water quality deteriorated to the point where it may have caused illness in those who consumed it. The labor required to clean and maintain these systems increased precisely when agricultural demands were pulling workers in other directions. The sacred cenotes of the northern lowlands, natural sinkholes that provided access to the underground water table, became increasingly important as surface water sources failed. Cities like Chichen Itza that controlled major cenotes gained political and economic advantages over rivals dependent on rainfall. Yet even these seemingly inexhaustible water sources showed signs of stress, with water tables dropping measurably during extended droughts. The effort required to haul water from depths that could exceed 60 feet limited the practical utility of many cenotes for large-scale agricultural irrigation. Cave formations throughout the region preserve detailed records of changing precipitation patterns in their stalactites and stalagmites. Oxygen isotope ratios in these formations indicate not just the amount of rainfall, but also its seasonal distribution and the temperature at which it fell. These records reveal a series of severe droughts beginning around 760 CE, with the most intense occurring between 800 and 830 CE. Rainfall during these periods dropped to perhaps 60% of normal, devastating for a civilization already pushing agricultural limits. The correlation between drought periods and political upheaval appears consistently across the Maya region. Cities that had maintained stable dynasties for centuries experienced rapid turnover of rulers during drought years. The traditional response to agricultural crisis, which involved intensified ritual activity and increased monument construction to appease the gods, diverted resources from practical responses while failing to address underlying environmental problems. The disconnect between elite religious responses and practical needs widened social fissures that had been manageable during periods of abundance. Deforestation effects extended beyond agriculture to impact every aspect of Maya life. The production of lime plaster, essential for construction and water storage, required enormous quantities of wood to fire limestone kilns. Calculations suggest that plastering a single temple pyramid required burning enough wood to deforest 50 hectares of mature forest. The constant replastering necessary in the humid climate meant continuous pressure on remaining forest resources. As nearby forests disappeared, the energy cost of transporting wood from distant sources made large-scale construction increasingly prohibitive. The disappearance of forest habitat triggered cascading ecological changes that further stressed agricultural systems. The loss of bird species that controlled insect populations led to increased crop pest damage. The decline of bats that pollinated important food plants reduced yields of fruits and vegetables that supplemented grain-based diets. The extirpation of large mammals eliminated a source of protein while also removing seed dispersers that had maintained forest diversity. Each species loss represented another unraveling thread in the ecological fabric that had supported Maya civilization. Soil chemistry analysis from residential areas reveals increasing reliance on household gardens as field agriculture faltered. These intensively managed plots, fertilized with household waste and ash, maintained higher productivity than depleted field soils but required constant labor input. The phosphorus and potassium concentrated in these gardens came at the expense of agricultural fields, representing a transfer of nutrients from communal to private spaces that reflected broader social fragmentation. Elite households with larger garden spaces and more available labor gained advantages that widened inequality during periods of scarcity. The northern lowlands, with their thinner soils and more pronounced dry season, experienced environmental degradation differently than the southern regions. The lack of surface rivers meant total dependence on rainfall and groundwater, making these areas more vulnerable to drought but potentially more sustainable during normal years due to lower population densities. The agricultural techniques developed here, including extensive use of stone mulch to conserve moisture and reduce erosion, represented adaptations that might have proven more sustainable had they been adopted earlier and more widely. Pollen records indicate that some regions began recovering forest cover even before sites were completely abandoned, suggesting that population decline preceded, rather than followed, political collapse in many areas. This demographic collapse, whether from famine, disease, or migration, reduced pressure on agricultural systems but came too late to prevent the breakdown of political and economic structures that depended on agricultural surplus. The feedback loops between environmental degradation, agricultural failure, and social disruption had passed critical thresholds from which recovery within the existing cultural framework proved impossible. Chemical analysis of human bones from the late Classic period reveals clear evidence of nutritional stress that worsened over time. Nitrogen isotope ratios indicate decreasing protein consumption, while markers of childhood malnutrition appear with increasing frequency. The average height of adult males declined by several centimeters between 750 and 850 CE, a clear indicator of chronic nutritional deficiency during growth periods. These biological markers of decline appeared across all social classes, though elite burials show somewhat better nutritional status until the very end. The drought that began in the year 810 CE arrived not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a gradual tightening of an already stressed system, each year slightly drier than the last, until the accumulated deficit transformed the landscape in ways that would have seemed impossible to those who remembered the abundant rains of their youth. Lake Chichancanab in the northern Yucatan, whose sediments preserve the most detailed record of this period, shows that water levels dropped by over 10 meters during the most severe phases, exposing vast expanses of lakebed that had been submerged for centuries. The gypsum deposits that form during these dry periods create distinct white bands in sediment cores, silent testimony to years when the rains failed completely. Paleoclimatologists studying these deposits have reconstructed precipitation patterns with remarkable precision, revealing not a single drought, but a series of multi-year dry periods separated by brief returns to normal rainfall that would have offered false hope of recovery. The drought of 810-815 was followed by a partial recovery, then an even more severe dry period from 820 to 828, another brief respite, and finally the catastrophic drought of 860-910 that delivered the final blow to an already reeling civilization. These cycles of crisis and temporary recovery prevented adaptive responses while exhausting social and economic reserves that might have enabled survival through a single prolonged crisis. The titanium concentrations in offshore marine sediments provide independent confirmation of these drought cycles, with lower titanium levels indicating reduced erosion from decreased rainfall. The correlation between multiple proxy records from across the region eliminates any doubt that these droughts were regional phenomena affecting the entire Maya lowlands rather than localized events. The spatial extent of the drought meant that traditional coping mechanisms such as temporary migration or increased trade with unaffected regions became impossible when every city faced similar challenges. Political fragmentation accelerated as resource scarcity intensified competition between neighboring polities. The elaborate alliance networks that had maintained relative stability for centuries dissolved into increasingly desperate conflicts over water sources, agricultural land, and remaining forest resources. The archaeological record from this period shows a marked increase in defensive architecture, with hastily constructed walls around previously open settlements, and the movement of populations from dispersed rural areas to fortified hilltops. These defensive measures, while perhaps necessary for immediate survival, diverted labor from agricultural production and accelerated the spiral of decline. Karakol, which had been one of the most powerful cities in the southern lowlands, exemplifies this pattern of political disintegration. The city's final monuments speak not of cosmic order and royal glory, but of military threats and defensive alliances. Excavations have revealed that the royal palace was burned around 895 CE, with evidence of violent destruction, including scattered human remains and valuable objects abandoned in the ruins. The terminus ritual deposits found in many structures, where ceramics were deliberately smashed and jade ornaments scattered, suggest organized abandonment rather than chaotic flight, but abandonment nonetheless. The intensification of warfare took forms that violated previous norms of elite competition. Where earlier conflicts had focused on the capture of rival nobles for ransom or sacrifice, late classic warfare increasingly targeted productive infrastructure and civilian populations. Agricultural terraces were deliberately destroyed, their retaining walls toppled to ensure erosion would render fields unusable. Reservoir dams were breached, releasing precious water stores and destroying the hydraulic infrastructure that had taken generations to construct. These scorched earth tactics might provide short-term military advantage, but guaranteed long-term regional collapse. Evidence from Dos Pilas reveals how quickly sophisticated political systems could descend into chaos. The site's defensive palisades, constructed in the 760s, incorporated stone monuments torn from temples and carved stelae used as building material, suggesting a complete breakdown of religious and political authority. The concentration of cooking vessels and domestic debris within what had been sacred precincts indicates that ceremonial spaces were converted to refugee camps as rural populations sought protection within defensive perimeters. The final occupation layers contain numerous projectile points and evidence of burning, testament to the site's violent end. Trade networks that had operated for over 1,000 years collapsed within a single generation. The distribution patterns of obsidian, traceable to specific geological sources through chemical analysis, show dramatic changes in the late 8th century. The volume of obsidian reaching sites in the Piton dropped by 90% between 760 and 820 CE, while the quality shifted from the premium green obsidian of central Mexican sources to lower quality local materials. This collapse of long-distance trade removed not just practical resources but also the exotic goods that elites required to maintain their status and reward followers. The port facilities at sites like Canquen on the Passion River, which had served as crucial transshipment points between highland and lowland trade networks, show evidence of sudden abandonment in the early 9th century. Warehouses were found still containing trade goods, including jade preforms, obsidian cores, and marine shells, suggesting that merchants fled without time to retrieve valuable inventories. The sophisticated accounting systems that had tracked these exchanges, evidenced by clay tokens and numerical notations, disappear from the archaeological record, indicating the collapse of the administrative infrastructure that enabled complex economic transactions. Salt production centers along the coast experienced their own crises as inland demand collapsed, and maritime trade routes became unreliable. The massive salt works at Punta Icacos, which had employed hundreds of workers and shipped preserved fish and salt throughout the lowlands, were abandoned so quickly that ceramic vessels were left in place still containing evaporated brine. The specialized knowledge required for large-scale salt production, passed down through generations of craft specialists, was lost within decades as workers dispersed to seek subsistence elsewhere. Refugee movements created demographic cascades that destabilized regions far from the initial centers of collapse. Isotope analysis of human remains reveals increasing numbers of non-local individuals in site burials during the 9th century, indicating large-scale population movements. These migrants, identified through strontium isotope signatures that reflect the geology of their childhood homes, appear in contexts suggesting they occupied marginal positions in their adoptive communities, often buried without grave goods in peripheral locations. The social disruption caused by these refugee influxes strained resources in receiving areas while depriving origin communities of their labor force. The northern lowlands initially benefited from southern collapse, with sites like Uxmal and Chichen Itza experiencing brief florescence as they absorbed refugees with valuable skills and knowledge. The Puuc architectural style that emerged during this period incorporated elements from multiple regional traditions, suggesting cultural synthesis driven by population mixing. Yet this northern prosperity proved temporary, as the same environmental and social pressures that had devastated the south spread northward, compounded by the additional stress of accommodating displaced populations. Settlement pattern surveys reveal the progressive contraction of occupied areas within cities as populations declined. At Copán, the urban core that had housed 28,000 people in 750 CE contained fewer than 5,000 by 850 CE. The elaborate residential compounds of the nobility were subdivided into smaller units or abandoned entirely, their cut stone blocks scavenged for humbler constructions. The careful urban planning that had characterized classic period cities gave way to opportunistic occupation of whatever structures remained serviceable without regard for their original functions. The abandonment of water management systems created feedback loops that accelerated urban collapse. Reservoirs that required constant maintenance to prevent siltation and algae growth quickly became unusable once the labor force necessary for their upkeep dispersed. Within a single rainy season, an unmaintained reservoir could fill with sediment that would have taken decades to accumulate under proper management. The failure of urban water supplies forced remaining populations to rely on distant sources, making continued occupation increasingly untenable. Archaeological evidence from house mounds in rural areas suggests that countryside depopulation preceded urban abandonment in many regions. The ceramic sequences from these modest structures typically end a generation or more before the last dated monuments in nearby cities, indicating that agricultural producers abandoned their lands while elites continued to sponsor construction projects. This bottom-up collapse pattern contradicts earlier theories that emphasized top-down political failure, suggesting instead that ecological and agricultural crisis drove the process, while political collapse was a consequence rather than cause. The distribution of grinding stones and other food processing equipment reveals changing dietary patterns as agricultural systems failed. The elaborate metetes used for producing fine corn flour for tortillas were replaced by crude grinding stones, suitable only for producing coarse meal for gruel. The variety of ceramic vessel forms decreased dramatically, with specialized shapes for particular foods disappearing in favor of generic bowls and jars. These material culture changes reflect not just economic simplification, but the loss of culinary traditions that had defined Maya identity for centuries. Human remains from the terminal classic period show evidence of increasingly violent deaths, with a higher percentage of individuals displaying trauma from edged weapons or blunt force injuries. Mass graves at sites like Kolha contain victims of all ages and both sexes, suggesting indiscriminate violence rather than formal warfare between combatants. The presence of cut marks on some bones consistent with defleshing has raised the possibility of survival cannibalism, though this interpretation remains controversial among Maya scholars. What is clear is that the social bonds that had prevented such violence for centuries dissolved under extreme stress. Caves that had served as sacred pilgrimage sites for millennia show evidence of terminal ritual activities that differed markedly from earlier practices. Rather than the careful placement of offerings in designated shrine areas, late deposits consist of smashed vessels and scattered human remains, suggesting desperate or violent ritual acts. The presence of infant and child remains in contexts suggesting sacrifice indicates that traditional prohibitions against certain forms of violence weakened as crisis deepened. These cave deposits often represent the very last evidence of activity at sites otherwise abandoned, final desperate appeals to gods who no longer answered. The collapse of specialized craft production meant the loss of technological knowledge that had accumulated over centuries. The techniques for producing the brilliant Maya blue pigment, which required precise temperature control and specific mineral ingredients, disappeared so completely that modern scientists required years of analysis to rediscover the process. Similarly, the methods for creating the finest polychrome ceramics, the formulas for durable stucco, and the astronomical calculations that enabled precise calendar correlations were lost within a generation or two of urban abandonment. This technological regression meant that even if environmental conditions had improved, the civilizational infrastructure could not have been quickly rebuilt. The blood of kings had always been the most precious offering to the gods, drawn from tongues and genitals with stingray spines and obsidian blades in acts of ritual purification that maintained the cosmic order. But as the 9th century progressed and the rains continued to fail, the carefully choreographed bloodletting ceremonies that had sufficed for generations gave way to increasingly desperate and violent attempts to compel divine intervention. The murals at Bonampak, painted in the final years before that city's abandonment, depict not the serene ritual bloodletting of earlier art, but the systematic torture of captives, their fingernails torn out and blood streaming from mutilated hands, while the king and his court observe with expressions that suggest grim determination rather than religious ecstasy. The escalation of human sacrifice during the terminal classic period represents a fundamental breakdown in the reciprocal relationship between rulers and gods that had structured Maya society for a millennium. Where earlier periods had seen sacrifice as a carefully regulated transfer of life force that maintained balance between the human and divine realms, the late 8th and early 9th centuries witnessed what can only be described as ritual panic. Mass sacrifice events, previously rare and associated with major architectural dedications, became increasingly common and increasingly arbitrary in their selection of victims. At the sacred cenote of Chichen Itza, the accumulation of human remains dating to this period tells a story of mounting desperation. The bones of children predominate in the later deposits, a marked change from earlier periods when sacrifice victims were primarily war captives or volunteers from the nobility. The presence of cut marks on many bones indicates that victims were sometimes dismembered before being thrown into the cenote, possibly to multiply the offering or to ensure that different gods received their portion. Gold and jade ornaments found among the bones suggest that even the wealthy were not immune from selection, or perhaps that they offered their own children in desperate attempts to end the crisis. The cash deposits from this period reveal a qualitative change in ritual practice that speaks to psychological as well as social breakdown. Where earlier caches contained carefully arranged precious objects positioned according to cosmic directions and numerological significance, late classic deposits often consist of randomly scattered materials showing signs of hasty deposition. Broken stelae were buried upside down, jade masks were deliberately smashed before interment, and ceramic vessels were killed, not with the single perforation traditional in earlier periods, but shattered into fragments. These destructive acts suggest not reverent offering, but angry repudiation of religious objects that had failed to deliver promised protection. The scribal tradition that had flourished for over 1,000 years began to collapse even before the cities themselves were abandoned. The last known long count date, recorded at Ternina in 909 CE, represents not just the end of monument carving, but the termination of an entire knowledge system that had structured Maya understanding of time and cosmos. The sophisticated calculations required to maintain multiple calendar cycles, predict eclipses, and coordinate ritual activities across hundreds of sites required years of training and generations of accumulated observations. As scribal schools closed and master scribes died without passing on their knowledge, This intellectual infrastructure dissolved within a single generation. Analysis of the latest hieroglyphic texts reveals a marked decline in scribal competence even before writing ceased entirely. Grammatical errors that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods appear with increasing frequency, while the elegant calligraphy of classic period texts degenerates into crude approximations of standard forms. The sophisticated wordplay and poetic parallelism that characterized earlier inscriptions disappears, replaced by formulaic repetitions of standard phrases. Some late texts appear to have been carved by individuals with only partial literacy, able to copy familiar passages but unable to compose original statements. The codices that contain detailed astronomical observations, historical chronicles, and religious texts were particularly vulnerable to the chaos of collapse. These bark paper books required constant care in the humid tropical climate, needing to be regularly unfolded, dried, and refolded to prevent mold and insect damage. The specialized knowledge required to read these texts, written in an archaic form of the language using complex logographic and syllabic combinations, was held by a tiny elite of scholar priests. When this intellectual class dispersed or died, libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge became meaningless collections of deteriorating bark that were abandoned, burned, or left to rot. Elite competition for diminishing resources took increasingly destructive forms as traditional mechanisms for managing conflict failed. The elaborate gift exchanges that had maintained alliance networks required surpluses that no longer existed, while the marriage alliances that had linked royal houses became liabilities when dowries could not be paid and inherited obligations could not be met. The practice of taking royal hostages to ensure compliance with treaty obligations broke down when cities could no longer feed extra mouths, leading to the execution of hostages and the consequent breakdown of diplomatic relations. The hoarding of resources by elites during the crisis period is evidenced by the distribution of storage facilities and their contents. Large ceramic jars capable of holding tons of grain have been found concentrated in palace complexes, often still containing carbonized maize and beans. These storage facilities were frequently hidden or disguised, built into platforms or concealed behind false walls, suggesting that elites feared theft by their own populations. The contrast between these hoarded supplies and evidence of malnutrition in commoner burials from the same period reveals the breakdown of reciprocal obligations that had previously ensured some degree of resource distribution during times of scarcity. Isotope analysis of elite versus commoner remains from the late classic period reveals dramatically divergent dietary patterns. While commoner bones show the signatures of declining protein consumption and increasing reliance on less nutritious foods like root vegetables, elite remains continue to show access to marine fish, turkey, and deer until very late in the collapse period. This dietary divergence indicates that social mechanisms for resource sharing had completely broken down, with elites using their remaining political and military power to monopolize food supplies rather than distribute them according to traditional obligations. The construction of what archaeologists term paranoid architecture accelerated in the final decades before abandonment. Palace complexes that had been open and accessible in earlier periods were modified with narrow, defensible entrances, internal barriers, and hidden passages that suggest fear of attack from within as well as without. Throne rooms were retrofitted with escape routes, treasure chambers were sealed and hidden, and residential areas were segregated from administrative spaces in ways that impeded the normal functioning of government. These architectural modifications reveal rulers who no longer trusted their own courts and administrators, let alone their subject populations. The breakdown of ideological legitimacy is visible in the changing iconography of the period. Traditional depictions of rulers as world trees connecting the earthly and celestial realms were replaced by images emphasizing military might and coercive power. The ceremonial bar, a symbol of religious authority carried by rulers in earlier art, disappears in favor of weapons and shields. Royal portraits that had shown rulers in elaborate costumes performing ritual duties increasingly depict them in warrior garb, standing over bound captives. This shift from religious to military imagery suggests that rulers could no longer claim divine mandate and relied instead on force to maintain control. The silence that fell over the great plazas where stelae had been erected for centuries was not sudden but gradual, spreading from site to site like a contagion of hopelessness. Cities that had commissioned new monuments every 5 years according to important calendar cycles began skipping dedication dates, then celebrating only major period endings, then falling silent entirely. The last monuments at many sites are clearly inferior productions, with shallow carving, abbreviated texts, and sometimes unfinished sections suggesting that resources or motivation failed before completion. The phenomenon of monument mutilation that characterizes the terminal classic period appears to represent more than simple vandalism or ritual termination. The systematic defacement of royal portraits, the chiseling away of hieroglyphic names, and the toppling and breaking of stelae required organized effort and suggests deliberate repudiation of royal authority. At some sites, monuments were not simply destroyed but deliberately arranged in patterns that inverted their original positions, placing rulers literally and symbolically beneath the earth rather than reaching toward the heavens. The cessation of monument production meant more than the end of historical record-keeping. It represented the collapse of the entire temporal framework that had organized Maya society. Without the regular dedication of period-ending monuments, the synchronization of calendar cycles across different sites became impossible. Communities that had coordinated agricultural activities, market days, and religious festivals according to shared temporal markers found themselves isolated in their own local time bubbles. This temporal fragmentation contributed to the broader social dissolution, removing one of the key organizing principles of Maya civilization. The archaeological evidence for terminal rituals at abandoned sites reveals both desperation and resignation. At Tikal, the royal palace was ceremonially burned, but not before valuable objects were carefully removed, suggesting organized abandonment rather than chaotic flight. Caches of broken jade and obsidian were deposited at the bases of major pyramids, possibly as offerings to ensure the building's spiritual protection after human caretakers departed. The careful sealing of tomb chambers and the blocking of pyramid stairways with rubble indicates that those who left expected never to return, but hoped to preserve these sacred spaces from desecration. The role of religious specialists during the collapse period appears to have been particularly tragic. Burial evidence suggests that many priests and shamans remained at their posts long after political authority had dissolved, maintaining shrine sites and performing rituals for diminishing audiences. Isolated deposits of incense burners and other ritual paraphernalia in otherwise abandoned structures indicate that religious practice continued in simplified forms even after institutional support disappeared. These lone practitioners, keeping alive traditions that had lost their social context, represent the last gasps of a dying civilization's attempt to maintain cosmic order. The transformation of religious practice from public spectacle to private devotion marks a fundamental shift in Maya spirituality. The great plaza rituals that had involved thousands of participants and required massive resource investments gave way to household shrines and family altars. The elaborate costumes and masks that had transformed rulers into deities were replaced by simple offerings of copal incense and maize. This democratization of religious practice, born of necessity rather than reform, would influence the syncretic traditions that emerged after European contact. The psychological impact of religious failure must have been devastating for a population that had understood every aspect of existence through a sacred lens. The gods who had promised prosperity in exchange for devotion had withdrawn their favor despite increasingly desperate offerings. The cosmic order that generations had worked to maintain through careful ritual observance had collapsed into chaos. The very foundation of meaning and purpose that had motivated the construction of pyramids, the conduct of warfare, and the organization of daily life had proven false. This crisis of meaning may have been as significant as material deprivation in driving the abandonment of cities. The evidence for what scholars term revitalization movements appears sporadically in the terminal classic period, suggesting that new religious ideas emerged in response to the failure of traditional practices. Unusual artifact assemblages, foreign religious symbols, and non-traditional burial practices indicate that some communities experimented with alternative spiritual frameworks. These movements, however, failed to provide the organizational structure necessary to maintain urban civilization, and may have actually accelerated fragmentation by undermining what remained of traditional authority. The diseases that swept through Maya cities in the 9th century left their signatures not in written records, but in the bones themselves, testament to suffering that went undocumented by scribes who had either fled or succumbed to the same ailments they might have recorded. Skeletal remains from terminal classic burials show a dramatic increase in periosteal reactions, those telltale bone inflammations that indicate systemic infection, while tooth enamel hypoplasia reveals that survivors of childhood diseases carried the marks of their survival into abbreviated adulthoods. The porotic hyperostosis, visible in countless skulls where bone appears spongy and porous, speaks to endemic anemia that weakened immune systems already stressed by malnutrition and parasitic infection. The concentration of populations in urban centers had always created conditions favorable to epidemic disease, but the breakdown of sanitation infrastructure in the late Classic period transformed manageable health challenges into demographic catastrophes. Water sources contaminated with human waste spread dysentery and typhoid, while the accumulation of garbage in abandoned sectors of cities created breeding grounds for disease vectors. The sophisticated drainage systems that had channeled rainwater and sewage away from residential areas became clogged with debris, turning streets into stagnant pools where mosquitoes bred in unprecedented numbers. Paleoparasitology, the study of ancient parasitic infections, reveals the heavy disease burden carried by late Classic populations. Coprolites from this period contain eggs of whipworm, roundworm, and hookworm in concentrations that indicate near universal infection. These parasitic loads, while rarely fatal in isolation, compromised nutrient absorption and weakened resistance to other pathogens. Children were particularly vulnerable, with growth stunting and delayed development evident in skeletal remains. The synergistic effects of malnutrition and parasitism created a downward spiral, where weakened individuals became progressively less capable of the labor required for food production. The evidence for tuberculosis in late Classic populations appears with disturbing frequency. Characteristic lesions on ribs and vertebrae, combined with DNA analysis that has confirmed the presence of Mycobacterium tuberculosis in bone tissue, indicate that this disease became endemic in crowded urban centers. The chronic nature of tuberculosis meant that infected individuals could spread the disease for years before succumbing, creating reservoirs of infection that persisted even as populations declined. The social response to visible illness, evidenced by the segregation of diseased individuals in separate burial areas, suggests that communities recognized contagion but lacked effective means of prevention. Yellow fever, though impossible to diagnose definitively in skeletal remains, likely played a role in urban depopulation based on ecological evidence for its vectors. The Aedes aegypti mosquito that transmits yellow fever thrives in the water storage vessels that became increasingly important as natural water sources failed. The ceramic jars and cisterns found in every household would have provided ideal breeding sites, while the deforestation that brought previously isolated monkey populations into contact with human settlements could have introduced the virus to unexposed populations. The hemorrhagic nature of yellow fever would have been particularly terrifying to a population that associated blood with divine power. Nutritional analysis of bone collagen reveals a population experiencing chronic protein deficiency that worsened progressively through the 9th century. Nitrogen isotope ratios indicate that the proportion of animal protein in diets decreased by over 60% between 750 and 900 CE, with most individuals subsisting primarily on maize and root vegetables by the terminal Classic period. This monotonous diet lacked essential amino acids and vitamins, leading to conditions like pellagra, scurvy, and beriberi that further compromised immune function. The appearance of cribra orbitalia, pitting in the eye sockets caused by severe anemia in over half of late Classic skeletons indicates widespread nutritional deficiency. The demographic profile of terminal Classic cemeteries reveals populations under extreme stress. Child mortality exceeded 50%, with peaks at weaning age when children transitioned from breast milk to solid food. Adult life expectancy dropped from around 40 years in the early Classic to less than 30 in the terminal period. The sex ratio in burials becomes increasingly skewed toward females, suggesting that males were dying in contexts that prevented proper burial, whether from warfare, flight, or occupational hazards associated with desperate attempts to maintain agricultural production. The cascade effect of urban collapse followed predictable patterns but with variations that reflected local conditions and connections. Cities that had served as primary centers typically fell first, their collapse sending waves of refugees to secondary sites that initially benefited from the influx of skilled craftspeople and laborers. But these demographic bonuses quickly became burdens as food supplies proved insufficient and social tensions erupted between locals and migrants. The collapse of one major center often triggered a domino effect, with allied cities losing access to trade networks, military support, and ideological legitimacy in rapid succession. Copán's collapse exemplifies this cascade pattern. The city's abandonment began in the urban periphery around 800 CE, with outlying residential groups showing cessation of construction and maintenance. By 820 CE, the royal palace complex was abandoned, though squatters occupied some structures for perhaps another generation. The final phase saw complete depopulation by 850 CE, with refugees traceable through ceramic styles appearing at sites in the Guatemalan highlands. These migrations, however, did not represent organized relocations but desperate flight, with families and small groups seeking survival wherever possible. The comparison with other civilizational collapses reveals both universal patterns and unique characteristics of the Maya case. Like the Western Roman Empire, the Maya collapse involved the fragmentation of a unified cultural system into localized survivals, with some regions maintaining simplified versions of earlier traditions, while others experienced complete discontinuity. The Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE shares the Maya pattern of simultaneous failure across multiple interconnected polities, suggesting that complex civilizations create vulnerabilities through their very interconnectedness. Yet the Maya collapse differs from these comparisons in its relationship to environmental factors. While Rome fell primarily to political and military pressures, and the Bronze Age collapse involved migrations of new peoples, the Maya faced an ecological crisis largely of their own making. The deforestation, soil depletion, and hydrological disruption that contributed to collapse resulted from centuries of intensive exploitation that exceeded the regenerative capacity of tropical ecosystems. This environmental dimension makes the Maya case particularly relevant to contemporary concerns about sustainability and climate change. The myth of sudden abandonment, popularized by early explorers who found empty cities consumed by jungle, obscures the extended process of decline that actually occurred. Detailed ceramic chronologies and radiocarbon dating reveal that most sites experienced gradual depopulation over multiple generations rather than catastrophic abandonment. At Tikal, for instance, construction of new buildings ceased around 830 CE, but existing structures continued to be occupied and maintained for another 50 years. The final abandonment phase, when even maintenance ceased, lasted perhaps another generation as the remaining population slowly dispersed. This gradual decline is evidenced by the progressive simplification of material culture over time. Elaborate polychrome pottery gave way to simple monochromes, then to crude utilitarian vessels, and finally to the adoption of gourds and baskets that leave little archaeological trace. Obsidian tools were resharpened until they became unusable nubs, then replaced with expedient chert flakes that required no specialized knowledge to produce. Architecture evolved from cut stone masonry to rubble construction to wattle and daub structures that reverted to prehistoric building techniques. The taphonomic evidence, how sites deteriorated after abandonment, provides insights into the pace and nature of depopulation. Buildings that collapsed from neglect showed different patterns than those deliberately destroyed or systematically dismantled for reusable materials. The presence of valuable objects left in situ suggests rapid abandonment under duress, while the careful removal of specific items indicates planned departure. The accumulation of soil and debris in structures reveals whether abandonment was simultaneous or staggered, with some buildings remaining in use while others deteriorated nearby. Squatter occupations in elite structures represent an intermediate phase between urban civilization and complete abandonment. These informal settlements, evidenced by crude hearths built in throne rooms and garbage middens in ceremonial courtyards, indicate that social hierarchies had completely dissolved. The people who cooked their meals in what had been sacred spaces either did not know or did not care about the structure's original significance. This loss of cultural memory within a single generation demonstrates how quickly complex knowledge systems can disappear when their institutional supports fail. The biological evidence for population mixing during the collapse period comes from dental morphology and genetic markers in skeletal remains. Non-metric dental traits that vary between populations show increasing heterogeneity in late terminal classic burials, indicating the presence of individuals from diverse geographic origins. Ancient DNA analysis, though still limited by preservation issues in tropical environments, suggests gene flow between previously isolated populations as social boundaries dissolved and people moved in search of survival. The zooarchaeological record reveals dramatic changes in human-animal relationships during the collapse period. The remains of dogs traditionally kept as hunting companions and ritual offerings show evidence of butchering and consumption that would have been taboo in earlier periods. The disappearance of turkey and deer bones from middens, replaced by remains of reptiles, amphibians, and even insects, indicates that preferred protein sources became unavailable and dietary restrictions relaxed under starvation pressure. The presence of human tooth marks on bones from some terminal deposits raises the disturbing possibility of survival cannibalism. Palynological evidence tracks the transformation of urban landscapes as human management ceased. Pioneer species like grasses and weedy plants colonized abandoned plazas within years, followed by fast-growing trees that began breaking apart stone structures with their roots. The sacred saber trees that had been carefully maintained in ceremonial precincts were overwhelmed by aggressive vines and strangler figs. Within a century of abandonment, most cities were unrecognizable beneath the returning forest, their pyramids becoming hills clothed in vegetation that hid all traces of human construction. The speed of forest regeneration varied with local conditions, but generally proceeded faster than might be expected. Nitrogen-fixing plants quickly colonized nutrient-depleted soils, beginning the process of restoration. Within 50 years, secondary forest covered most abandoned agricultural lands, though the species composition differed markedly from the primary forest that had existed before human disturbance. The full recovery of mature tropical forest ecosystems required centuries, and in some areas has still not occurred over 1,000 years later. The survival of small populations in reduced circumstances is evidenced by isolated activity areas within otherwise abandoned sites. These remnant groups, perhaps numbering in the dozens where thousands had lived, maintained simplified versions of traditional practices. They continued to place offerings at shrine sites, though these consisted of simple ceramic vessels rather than elaborate caches. They buried their dead in ancestral cemeteries, though without the grave goods that had accompanied earlier interments. These survivors represent the bridge between classic civilization and the post-collapse societies encountered by Spanish conquistadors. The epidemiological consequences of population dispersal created different disease dynamics than those of concentrated urban centers. While epidemic diseases require population densities above critical thresholds to sustain transmission, the scattered groups of collapse survivors fell below these thresholds. Diseases that had become endemic in cities died out in rural populations, though at the cost of losing immunological memory that would have catastrophic consequences when Old World diseases arrived with European contact. The demographic bottleneck of the collapse period may have reduced genetic diversity in ways that increased vulnerability to later epidemics. The collapse that devastated the southern lowlands did not strike everywhere with equal force or timing, creating a complex mosaic of abandonment, survival, and even temporary prosperity that challenges any simple narrative of civilizational end. While Tikal and Copán lay empty by 900 CE, cities in the northern Yucatan like Uxmal and Chichen Itza were entering periods of architectural innovation and demographic growth that would continue for another century or more. This regional variation in collapse patterns reveals that the crisis was not a single event, but a series of interconnected failures that rippled across the Maya world at different rates and intensities, shaped by local environmental conditions, political structures, and adaptive capacities. The Puke region of the northwestern Yucatan experienced what archaeologists term a brief florescence during the very period when southern cities were failing. Sites like Uxmal, Kabah, Sayil, and Labna witnessed an explosion of construction between 850 and 950 CE, producing some of the most architecturally sophisticated buildings in the entire Maya tradition. The distinctive Puke style, characterized by elaborate geometric mosaics, repeated mask motifs, and innovative corbelled arches, represents not the last gasps of a dying civilization, but a creative synthesis that drew on multiple regional traditions brought together by refugee craftspeople and architects. The success of Puke sites during this period stemmed partly from environmental advantages that the southern lowlands lacked. The northern Yucatan's geology, dominated by porous limestone with minimal soil cover, had always precluded the intensive agriculture that depleted southern soils. Instead, northern populations had developed sophisticated water management strategies centered on chultans, bottle-shaped underground cisterns carved from bedrock that could store thousands of gallons of rainwater. These systems proved more resilient to drought than the surface reservoirs of southern cities, which lost massive amounts of water to evaporation during dry periods. Population estimates from settlement surveys indicate that sites like Sayil housed up to 17,000 people during their 9th century peak, with carefully planned urban layouts that managed space more efficiently than the organic growth patterns of older southern cities. The residential complexes of Sayil were organized around shared courtyards with communal water storage, creating social units that could respond collectively to resource stress. This architectural arrangement fostered cooperation rather than competition, a crucial advantage during periods of scarcity. The agricultural strategies of the Puke region also differed markedly from southern practices. Rather than attempting continuous cultivation, northern farmers practiced a form of managed succession that allowed forest regeneration while maintaining productivity. They created stone-walled garden plots called petcot that concentrated fertile soil and moisture, enabling intensive cultivation of small areas while leaving larger zones for forest recovery. The extensive use of arboriculture, particularly the cultivation of ramon and other tree crops, provided dietary diversity and resilience against annual crop failures. Yet even the Puk fluorescence proved temporary, lasting barely a century before these sites, too, were abandoned. The very success that attracted refugees from the south eventually overwhelmed the region's carrying capacity. Excavations at Sayil reveal that the latest construction phases used inferior materials and showed signs of hasty execution, suggesting that resources were becoming strained even at the height of apparent prosperity. The last dated monument in the Puk region comes from 907 CE, after which the archaeological record falls silent just as it had in the south. Chichen Itza represents a different survival strategy, one based on military dominance and control of critical resources rather than agricultural innovation. The site's location near the massive cenote that gave it its name provided a reliable water source that became increasingly valuable as climate deteriorated. But Chichen Itza's success derived primarily from its position as a nexus of trade routes that connected the salt beds of the northern coast with the cacao-producing regions of the south and the obsidian sources of the Mexican highlands. The architectural and artistic styles of Chichen Itza reveal profound cultural changes that accompanied this economic transformation. The appearance of distinctly central Mexican elements, including serpent columns, warrior figures, and skull racks, suggests either the arrival of foreign elites or the deliberate adoption of foreign symbols to legitimize new forms of power. The Great Ball Court, the largest in Mesoamerica, depicts scenes of decapitation and sacrifice that exceed anything known from classic period sites, indicating that violence had become central to political ideology in ways that would have been unthinkable centuries earlier. The coastal trading centers of the Caribbean and Gulf coasts experienced the collapse period differently than inland sites, with some actually benefiting from the disruption of traditional trade networks. Sites like Isla Cerritos and Vista Alegre on the north coast became important transshipment points for a reconfigured maritime trade network that bypassed the failed inland routes. The adoption of new sailing technologies, possibly introduced through contact with Caribbean island populations, enabled longer-distance voyages that connected previously isolated regions. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites reveals a shift from the luxury goods that had dominated classic period trade to more practical commodities. Salt, dried fish, and cotton textiles replaced jade, feathers, and elaborate ceramics as the primary trade goods. This democratization of commerce reflected the collapse of elite-controlled distribution networks and the emergence of more market-based exchange systems. Coastal populations developed new preservation techniques for marine products, including sophisticated salt drying operations that produced a storable protein source crucial for inland populations facing agricultural crisis. The transformation of Lamanai, located on the new river lagoon in Belize, illustrates successful adaptation to collapse conditions. Unlike most southern lowland sites, Lamanai maintained continuous occupation from the pre-classic through the Spanish colonial period. The site's location on a major waterway provided transportation advantages, while the lagoon ecosystem offered diverse resources including fish, turtles, and waterfowl that supplemented agricultural production. The pottery sequence from Lamanai shows gradual stylistic changes rather than abrupt breaks, indicating cultural continuity despite the broader regional collapse. Migration patterns reconstructed from ceramic distributions and architectural styles reveal complex population movements that defy simple models of rural to urban or lowland to highland flight. Some groups moved relatively short distances, establishing new communities just beyond the ecological zones that had failed. Others undertook migrations of hundreds of miles, traceable through the appearance of distinctive pottery styles in regions where they had never before been found. These movements were not unidirectional flows, but complex circulations that sometimes involved return migrations when conditions changed. The Guatemala highlands received substantial influxes of lowland refugees, evidenced by the sudden appearance of lowland ceramic styles and architectural techniques at sites like Zaculo and Iximche. These migrants brought sophisticated knowledge of writing, astronomy, and craft production that enriched highland cultures, though the hieroglyphic writing system itself disappeared within a generation or two. The synthesis of lowland and highland traditions created new cultural forms that would persist through the post-classic period and influence the Quiche and Kaqchikel kingdoms encountered by Spanish conquistadors. Isotope analysis of human remains from highland sites reveals the presence of first-generation migrants who spent their childhoods in the lowlands before relocating. These individuals often occupied positions of respect in their adoptive communities, buried with offerings that suggest they were valued for their specialized knowledge. The integration of lowland refugees appears to have been relatively peaceful, perhaps because highland populations were sparse enough to absorb newcomers without severe resource competition. The Pacific Coast Piedmont region experienced demographic growth during the collapse period as populations shifted to areas with more reliable rainfall and fertile volcanic soils. Sites like El Baúl and Cochumalguapa developed distinctive artistic styles that blended Maya traditions with influences from central Mexico and the Gulf Coast. The cacao plantations of this region became increasingly important as lowland production failed, with coastal communities controlling a commodity that remained valuable for ritual and elite consumption, even as other luxury goods lost their significance. The survival strategies of different regions reveal the importance of ecological diversity in determining outcomes. Areas with access to multiple environmental zones, such as places where mountains met coastal plains, or where rivers created gallery forests within drier regions, showed greater resilience than environmentally homogeneous zones. The ability to shift between different subsistence strategies as conditions changed provided crucial flexibility that monoagricultural regions lacked. The northern Maya cities that survived the initial collapse waves developed new forms of political organization that differed markedly from classic period kingdoms. The multipal or joint rule system that emerged at Chichen Itza and later at Mayapan involved councils of nobles rather than single divine kings, a power-sharing arrangement that may have prevented the destructive succession disputes that plagued classic period dynasties. These new political forms, while less capable of mobilizing resources for monumental construction, proved more stable and adaptable to changing conditions. The role of climate variation in regional collapse patterns becomes clear when comparing precipitation records from different areas. The northern Yucatan, while still affected by drought, experienced less severe rainfall deficits than the southern lowlands. The bicameral rainfall pattern of the north, with precipitation peaks in both early summer and fall, provided more opportunities for agricultural recovery when one rainy season failed. Coastal areas benefited from orographic rainfall created by sea breezes, maintaining local precipitation even during regional droughts. Defensive architecture appears with different intensities across regions, suggesting varying levels of conflict during the collapse period. Southern sites show extensive fortifications including walls, moats, and defensive terraces, indicating endemic warfare. Northern sites, by contrast, show fewer defensive modifications, suggesting that either conflict was less intense or that political consolidation under powerful centers like Chichen Itza provided regional security. Coastal sites generally lack defensive features entirely, perhaps because maritime mobility provided escape options that inland populations lacked. The persistence of ceremonial activity varied dramatically between regions. While southern sites show complete cessation of monument dedication and temple construction by 900 CE, northern sites continued these practices for another century or more. The stele of Uxmal and the elaborate facades of Puuc architecture represent continued investment in religious infrastructure, even as the south lay abandoned. This regional variation in religious continuity suggests that the ideological crisis that accompanied southern collapse was not universal, with some areas maintaining traditional beliefs and practices longer than others. The transformation of trade networks created new patterns of wealth distribution that favored previously marginal regions. The east coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, relatively unimportant during the Classic period, became a major trading corridor during the post-Classic as maritime commerce replaced overland routes. Sites like Tulum and Tanca, while never matching the architectural grandeur of classic cities, became prosperous trading ports that maintained connections from Honduras to central Mexico. The wealth generated by this coastal trade supported continued urban life, albeit on a smaller scale than classic period cities. Cave use patterns reveal regional differences in ritual responses to crisis. Southern caves show evidence of desperate terminal rituals including human sacrifice and the destruction of sacred objects. Northern caves, however, continued to receive traditional offerings of ceramics and incense throughout the collapse period, suggesting greater religious continuity. The famous cave of Balancanche near Chichen Itza contains elaborate offerings that date to the very period when southern religious systems were disintegrating, indicating that proximity to collapse did not necessarily mean identical responses. The linguistic evidence preserved in colonial documents suggests that population movements during the collapse period contributed to the dialect differentiation visible in modern Mayan languages. Yucatec Maya shows lexical borrowings from Cholan languages that likely arrived with southern refugees, while highland languages preserve lowland grammatical features that indicate substantial migration. These linguistic traces provide independent confirmation of population movements suggested by archaeological evidence. The rigid social hierarchy that had structured Maya society for over a millennium did not simply disappear, but rather imploded from within, as the mechanisms that had maintained class distinctions for generations ceased to function in the face of systemic collapse. The divine mandate that had justified royal authority rang hollow when kings could no longer ensure rainfall or successful harvests, while the tribute obligations that had sustained noble privileges became impossible to enforce when agricultural surpluses vanished. Archaeological evidence from terminal classic contexts reveals not gradual social evolution, but violent overthrow, with palace complexes showing signs of deliberate destruction that specifically targeted symbols of elite power while leaving utilitarian structures intact. The traditional division of Maya society into distinct classes had created specialized dependencies that proved catastrophic when systems failed. The royal Ahau class, who claimed descent from gods and monopolized religious authority, found their divine genealogies meaningless when the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned the world. The noble Almahenob, who had served as administrators, war leaders, and high priests, discovered that their literacy and calendrical knowledge offered no solutions to ecological collapse. The skilled artisans who had produced luxury goods for elite consumption found no market for jade ornaments and feather cloaks when even basic necessities became scarce. Only the farmers and laborers who comprised the majority of the population possessed the practical skills necessary for survival, yet they had been so thoroughly exploited that few remained capable of independent action. Evidence for commoner uprisings appears throughout the archaeological record of the late 9th century, though the absence of written records from this period means that these events must be reconstructed from material remains. At Canquen, the royal palace was burned while still occupied, with the bodies of 31 individuals, including the king and queen, left unburied in the throne room. The violence appears to have been targeted specifically at the ruling class, as nearby commoner residences show no signs of destruction. The presence of crude spear points made from locally available materials rather than the specialized weapons of professional warriors suggests that the attackers were local inhabitants rather than foreign invaders. The pattern of selective destruction visible at many sites indicates that violence was directed not randomly, but at specific symbols and institutions of elite power. Hieroglyphic inscriptions were systematically defaced, with royal names and titles chiseled away, while other portions of texts remained intact. Throne stones were overturned and broken, royal portraits were mutilated, and the elaborate headdresses depicted in stone were deliberately destroyed. These acts required considerable effort and served no practical purpose, suggesting deep anger directed at the memory and symbols of royal authority. The breakdown of specialized labor systems created cascading failures throughout Maya society. The production of obsidian tools required not just access to raw materials, but knowledge of specific reduction techniques passed down through generations of craftspeople. When these specialists dispersed or died without training successors, communities lost the ability to produce efficient cutting implements. Similarly, the production of lime plaster for construction and water storage required specialized knowledge of kiln construction and temperature control that vanished when expert craftspeople abandoned their workshops. The disappearance of specialized pottery production reveals how quickly technological knowledge could be lost. The elaborate polychrome vessels that characterized classic Maya ceramics required mastery of multiple clay sources, complex firing techniques, and sophisticated painting skills developed over years of apprenticeship. Within a single generation, these techniques vanished so completely that later populations could not replicate them despite having access to the same raw materials. The crude, handmade vessels that replaced wheel-thrown pottery in terminal deposits represent not stylistic choice but technological regression. Textile production, primarily a female specialization, shows similar patterns of knowledge loss. The complex backstrap loom techniques that had produced elaborate brocaded fabrics disappeared, replaced by simple plain weaves that required minimal skill. The cultivation and processing of cotton declined as agricultural lands were converted to food production, while the sophisticated dyeing techniques that had produced vibrant colors were forgotten as the specialized plants and minerals required became unavailable. Elite women who had overseen large-scale textile production found their managerial skills worthless when the workshops they supervised dispersed. The scribal class faced perhaps the most complete obsolescence, as their elaborate knowledge of hieroglyphic writing, astronomical calculation, and calendar correlation became irrelevant to populations struggling for basic survival. The years of training required to master the Maya writing system, with its complex combination of logographic and syllabic elements, meant that literacy could not be maintained without institutional support. The closing of scribal schools and the cessation of monument production eliminated both the means of transmission and the purpose for maintaining these skills. Some evidence suggests that members of the scribal class attempted to preserve their knowledge through simplified or alternative means. The appearance of crude pseudo-glyphic designs on late pottery may represent attempts by partially literate individuals to maintain writing traditions. The few surviving codices from later periods show simplified versions of classic period writing, suggesting that some knowledge was preserved but in degraded form. The transition from stone monuments to bark paper books may have been partly an adaptation to the collapse of the institutional structures that had supported monumental art. The medical knowledge possessed by healing specialists proved more resilient than other forms of elite knowledge, as the practical value of medicinal plants and healing techniques remained relevant regardless of social structure. Archaeological evidence from terminal classic sites includes caches of medicinal plants and healing implements in contexts suggesting continued practice. However, the elaborate ritual aspects of classic period medicine, which had integrated astronomical observations and calendrical calculations with practical healing, disappeared as the cosmological framework supporting these practices dissolved. The survival strategies adopted by different social classes diverged dramatically as collapse progressed. Elites who had accumulated portable wealth in the form of jade, obsidian, and exotic shells attempted to convert these resources into food and protection, but found their traditionally valuable goods increasingly worthless as practical needs dominated exchange. Some elite families appear to have attempted to maintain their status by controlling remaining water sources or defensive positions, but without the ideological framework that had justified their authority, these efforts typically failed within a generation. Archaeological evidence from elite residential complexes reveals various adaptation strategies, from the subdivision of palace compounds into smaller units housing multiple families to the conversion of ceremonial spaces into storage facilities. Some elite families appear to have attempted to maintain traditional practices in reduced circumstances, continuing to conduct private rituals and maintain ancestor shrines even as public ceremonies ceased. The presence of high-status goods in terminal deposits suggests that some elites chose to remain with their ancestral holdings rather than flee, perhaps hoping for eventual recovery that never came. Commoner survival strategies focused on immediate subsistence needs and involved significant changes in settlement patterns and social organization. The dispersal from nucleated settlements to scattered farmsteads reduced competition for local resources while eliminating the tribute obligations that had supported elite populations. Extended family groups that had been separated by labor obligations reunited in small hamlets where reciprocal aid networks could function without interference from state institutions. These smaller social units proved more resilient than the complex hierarchical structures they replaced. The reversion to swidden agriculture on a household scale, while less productive than the intensive systems of the classic period, proved more sustainable given reduced population densities. Families could once again practice long fallow periods that allowed forest regeneration and soil recovery. The diversity of household gardens combining food plants, medicinal herbs, and useful trees provided resilience against crop failures that monoculture could not match. The knowledge of wild food resources, preserved primarily among the poorest segments of society, became crucial for survival as agricultural systems failed. Gender roles underwent significant transformation during the collapse period, with traditional divisions of labor breaking down under survival pressures. Women who had been restricted to domestic production in elite households took on agricultural roles previously reserved for men. Men who had specialized in ritual or administrative functions were forced to learn practical skills they had previously disdained. The archaeological record shows increasing overlap in the distribution of gender-specific artifacts, suggesting that rigid role distinctions gave way to pragmatic flexibility. The treatment of the elderly and infirm reveals the breakdown of social support systems that had characterized classic period society. While earlier periods show evidence of care for disabled individuals, including healed fractures, and survival with debilitating conditions, terminal classic burials increasingly show untreated injuries and premature death among the elderly. The communal support systems that had ensured survival for non-productive members of society collapsed when even productive individuals faced starvation. This breakdown of intergenerational care disrupted the transmission of cultural knowledge that depended on elderly specialists. Children born during the collapse period faced dramatically different life prospects than their parents' generation. The elaborate naming ceremonies, cranial modification practices, and dental decorations that had marked social identity ceased almost entirely. Education, which for elite children had included years of training in writing, mathematics, and ritual knowledge, disappeared along with the institutions that had provided it. The generation that came of age during the collapse grew up without the cultural framework that had defined Maya identity for centuries, creating a profound discontinuity that would never be fully bridged. The evidence for social mobility during the collapse period appears in burial contexts, where individuals with commoner skeletal characteristics were interred with elite goods, suggesting that traditional class barriers had broken down. Conversely, individuals with elite skeletal markers, such as cranial modification, appear in simple burials without grave goods, indicating downward mobility or the irrelevance of traditional status markers. This social fluidity, while perhaps offering opportunities for some, primarily reflected the dissolution of the structures that had provided social stability. The role of military specialists underwent radical transformation as professional warrior classes gave way to community self-defense. The elaborate warrior costumes and specialized weapons that had characterized classic period warfare disappeared, replaced by expedient weapons that could be produced locally. The ritual aspects of warfare, including the capture of noble prisoners for sacrifice, gave way to pragmatic violence focused on resource control. The breakdown of rules governing warfare led to increasingly destructive conflicts that targeted productive infrastructure rather than symbolic victories. Craft specialists who had depended on elite patronage faced complete economic collapse as demand for luxury goods evaporated. Jade workers, feather artists, and sculptors found their skills worthless in a society focused on basic survival. Some appear to have attempted to maintain their crafts by producing simplified versions of traditional items for local consumption, but the technical quality declined rapidly without the materials and time investment that elite patronage had provided. The workshops that had been centers of technological innovation and artistic achievement were abandoned or converted to more practical purposes. The psychological impact of social collapse on individuals accustomed to rigid hierarchies must have been profound. Elite individuals raised to believe in their divine descent and natural superiority faced not just loss of privilege, but complete invalidation of their worldview. Commoners who had accepted subordination as divinely ordained discovered that their supposed superiors were as helpless as themselves in the face of ecological collapse. The cognitive dissonance created by these revelations contributed to the broader cultural discontinuity that characterized the terminal classic period. Religious specialists occupied an ambiguous position during the collapse, as communities still required ritual services even as the institutional framework supporting religious practice dissolved. Some priests appear to have maintained simplified versions of traditional ceremonies, adapting to reduced resources and changing beliefs. Others may have introduced new religious ideas that better explain the collapse than traditional Maya theology. The syncretism visible in post-classic religion suggests that various religious traditions competed and combined during the chaotic collapse period. The emergence of new forms of social organization in post-collapse communities represented adaptations to changed circumstances rather than conscious reform. The egalitarian structures visible in early post-classic settlements were not ideological choices but practical responses to the absence of surpluses that could support social stratification. The councils of elders that replaced divine kingship in some regions emerged from the need for collective decision-making in the absence of centralized authority. These new social forms, born of necessity rather than planning, would shape Maya society for centuries after the collapse. The Great Pyramids of Tikal did not stand empty for long after the royal court fled, though those who came to occupy the abandoned palaces bore no resemblance to the divine kings who had built them. Within a generation of elite abandonment, small groups of survivors had established camps within the ceremonial precincts, using the massive stone structures not for their intended ritual purposes, but as convenient shelters and sources of building material. Excavations in the central Acropolis reveal crude hearths built directly on plastered floors where royal feet had once tread, corn-grinding stones set up in throne rooms, and makeshift walls of recycled stone blocks creating small living spaces within vast ceremonial halls. These post-collapse occupants left traces that speak to radically transformed relationships with the monumental architecture surrounding them. Where classic period inhabitants had regularly replastered and repainted buildings to maintain their pristine appearance, the terminal occupants allowed structures to deteriorate while focusing their limited energy on basic survival. They pulled wooden lintels from doorways to use as firewood, leaving openings to collapse. They removed carved stone facades to build simple shelters, showing no reverence for the artistic achievements these monuments represented. Most tellingly, they established their cooking fires and refused dumps in spaces that had been kept ritually pure for centuries, indicating either ignorance of or indifference to the sacred significance of these locations. The material culture of these squatter communities reveals populations struggling to maintain basic subsistence with dramatically simplified technology. The sophisticated ceramic traditions that had produced elaborate polychrome vessels gave way to crude, handmade pottery, fired in open hearths rather than specialized kilns. Stone tools reverted to simple expedient flakes rather than the carefully crafted implements of earlier periods. Even basic maintenance of water collection systems ceased, with reservoirs filling with sediment, while occupants relied on ceramic jars to collect rainwater from deteriorating roofs. Patterns of refuse disposal in post-collapse contexts indicate that populations no longer maintained the clear spatial divisions between sacred and profane spaces that had characterized classic period sites. Kitchen middens accumulated against the bases of pyramid temples, human waste was deposited in abandoned palace rooms, and animal bones from meals were scattered across formerly pristine plazas. This transformation of space usage represents not mere convenience but a fundamental shift in worldview, from one that saw the built environment as cosmologically significant to one focused entirely on practical utility. The evidence from smaller sites presents a more complex picture of post-collapse adaptation. While major centers were abandoned or occupied only by scattered squatters, many minor settlements maintained continuous occupation through the collapse period and beyond. These communities, typically located near reliable water sources and good agricultural land, had never fully depended on the elaborate infrastructure of urban centers. Their simplified material culture and reduced social complexity actually positioned them better for survival when complex systems failed. Archaeological surveys in the Belize River Valley reveal that rural populations reorganized themselves into dispersed hamlets of 5 to 10 households, connected by kinship ties and reciprocal labor arrangements. These communities practiced a mixed subsistence strategy, combining small-scale agriculture with hunting, fishing, and gathering of wild resources. The absence of elite oversight allowed them to adjust their agricultural practices to local conditions, abandoning the intensive techniques that had led to soil exhaustion in favor of more sustainable long fallow systems. The ceramic traditions maintained in these rural communities show interesting patterns of selective retention and innovation. While the elaborate painted designs of classic period pottery disappeared, basic forming techniques and vessel shapes continued with remarkable conservatism. Some communities developed new decorative styles that combined simplified versions of classic motifs with entirely new design elements, suggesting active cultural creativity rather than mere degeneration. These local pottery traditions would persist for centuries, providing archaeological markers of cultural continuity despite political collapse. House construction in post-collapse communities reverted to techniques that required neither specialized labor nor exotic materials. The cut stone masonry and elaborate plasterwork of classic period architecture gave way to pole and thatch structures similar to those used before the rise of complex society. Yet these buildings were not merely primitive shelters, but carefully adapted structures incorporating generations of accumulated knowledge about local climate, materials, and construction techniques. The raised floors, strategic ventilation, and water-shedding roof designs show sophisticated understanding of tropical construction despite the absence of monumental architecture. Agricultural practices in post-collapse communities combine traditional Maya techniques with adaptations necessitated by changed circumstances. The milpa system of forest clearing and cultivation continued, but with longer fallow periods made possible by reduced population pressure. Home gardens became increasingly important, with households maintaining diverse assemblages of food plants, medicinal herbs, and useful trees in the spaces immediately around dwellings. the selection of cultigens shifted toward hardy varieties that required less maintenance and provided more reliable yields than the high productivity but high maintenance varieties favored during the Classic period. The role of wild resources in post-collapse subsistence strategies increased dramatically, as evidenced by the faunal and botanical remains from terminal and post-collapse contexts. Deer bones appear more frequently in middens, suggesting that forest regeneration had restored habitat for game animals. Seeds from wild fruits, nuts from forest trees, and shells from riverine mollusks indicate broad-spectrum foraging that supplemented agricultural production. This diversified subsistence base provided resilience against agricultural failures that the Classic period's agricultural specialization had lacked. Social organization in post-collapse communities appears to have been based on extended family groups rather than the hierarchical structures of the Classic period. Burial patterns show little differentiation in grave goods or tomb construction, suggesting relatively egalitarian social relations. The absence of elaborate public architecture indicates that communities no longer mobilized labor for projects beyond immediate household needs. Leadership, when it existed, appears to have been based on age, experience, and personal capability rather than hereditary privilege or divine mandate. Religious practice continued in modified forms that required neither specialized priests nor elaborate temples. Household shrines replaced public temples as the focus of ritual activity, with simple ceramic censers and figurines substituting for elaborate ritual paraphernalia. The syncretic blend of traditional Maya beliefs with new religious ideas that characterizes post-classic and colonial period religion likely began during this transitional period. Communities maintained ritual calendars and agricultural ceremonies, but without the astronomical precision and elaborate mythology that had required specialized knowledge to maintain. The transformation from urban to rural life involved not just changes in settlement patterns, but fundamental shifts in daily rhythms and social interactions. The complex scheduling of urban life, with its market days, ritual observances, and administrative obligations, gave way to simpler patterns governed by agricultural cycles and seasonal changes. The constant interaction with diverse populations that characterized urban centers was replaced by intensive interaction within small, stable communities where everyone knew everyone else across multiple generations. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Maya region in the early 16th century, they encountered not the mighty civilization described in native legends, but scattered populations living in relatively simple communities. The contrast between the massive, abandoned ruins they observed and the modest settlements of contemporary Maya peoples led to persistent myths about mysterious disappearances and lost civilizations. Yet the people Cortés and his followers encountered were direct descendants of the classic Maya, maintaining cultural traditions that had persisted through 6 centuries of adaptation and change. The Spanish accounts describe populations that had retained core elements of Maya culture, despite the absence of the institutional structures that had supported them during the Classic period. Languages remained mutually intelligible with Classic period inscriptions, though writing systems had been largely forgotten. Agricultural techniques, house construction methods, and craft traditions showed clear continuities with archaeological evidence from Classic period commoner contexts. Religious beliefs, while transformed by centuries of syncretism, retained fundamental concepts about world structure, divine forces, and human obligations that would have been familiar to Classic period priests. Spanish observers noted the reverence with which indigenous populations regarded ancient ruins, even when they could not explain who had built them or why. Communities maintained prohibitions against disturbing certain structures, conducted rituals at abandoned temples, and told stories about the powerful beings who had once inhabited these places. These attitudes suggest that cultural memory of the collapse persisted, even when specific historical details had been forgotten. The ruins served as tangible links to a past that remained psychologically important, even when its precise nature had become mythologized. The oral traditions recorded by Spanish chroniclers and preserved in indigenous documents like the books of Chilambalam contain fragmented memories of the collapse period, though filtered through centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. Stories of drought, warfare, and divine abandonment appear consistently across different sources, suggesting genuine historical memories rather than later fabrications. The emphasis on moral failure as a cause of collapse, with rulers becoming proud and forgetting their obligations to gods and people, may preserve authentic cultural interpretations of the crisis even when specific facts were forgotten. The Chilambalam texts describe cycles of creation and destruction that positioned the collapse within a broader cosmological framework of recurring catastrophes. This cyclical view of history allowed communities to understand the collapse not as a unique catastrophe but as part of a natural pattern of rise and fall. The prediction that similar collapses would occur in the future, which Spanish observers interpreted as primitive fatalism, actually represented sophisticated understanding of the vulnerabilities inherent in complex societies. Place names preserved in colonial documents often reference events or conditions from the collapse period. Settlements called Where the Water Dried Up, Place of the Scattered Stones, or Where the People Fled, suggest that landscape memories of the crisis persisted for centuries. The avoidance of certain areas considered cursed or dangerous may reflect genuine memories of places where particularly traumatic events occurred during the collapse. These toponyms provide independent evidence for the nature and extent of the crisis beyond what archaeology alone can reveal. The linguistic evidence for post-collapse population movements appears in loanwords, dialect distributions, and place names recorded in colonial sources. The presence of Nahuatl loanwords in Yucatec Maya suggests contact with central Mexican populations during the post-classic period. The distribution of Cholan language features across areas where they were not historically native indicates substantial migration from the southern lowlands. These linguistic traces corroborate archaeological evidence for population movements while providing additional detail about the origins and destinations of migrant groups. Indigenous strategies for dealing with Spanish colonization often drew on cultural memories of earlier adaptations to crisis. The pattern of fleeing to forest refuges, maintaining reduced communities in isolation, and selectively adopting foreign practices while preserving core traditions had been established during the collapse period. The Maya response to European diseases, which included dispersal to reduce transmission and reliance on traditional medicine when European remedies failed, paralleled earlier responses to epidemic disease during the collapse. The persistence of Maya populations through both the classic collapse and Spanish colonization demonstrates remarkable cultural resilience. Despite losing perhaps 90% of their population to collapse and disease, experiencing complete political subjugation, and facing intensive pressure to abandon traditional practices, Maya communities maintained distinct identities and cultural practices. The strategies developed during the collapse period for preserving essential knowledge while adapting to radically changed circumstances proved crucial for long-term survival. Colonial period. Maya rebellions often invoke the memory of past greatness represented by ancient ruins, using these monuments as rallying points for resistance against Spanish domination. The leaders of such movements sometimes claimed descent from classic period royalty, though such claims were impossible to verify after centuries of disruption. The psychological power of the ruins as symbols of indigenous achievement and potential provided motivation for resistance even when the specific history of these places had been forgotten. The selective preservation of classic period knowledge reveals much about what post-collapse communities considered essential versus disposable. Practical knowledge related to agriculture, construction, and craft production survived relatively intact. Medicinal knowledge, including the use of local plants and healing techniques, continued through oral transmission. Basic calendrical knowledge sufficient for agricultural planning persisted, though the elaborate astronomical calculations of the classic period disappeared. This pattern suggests that communities made conscious choices about what knowledge to preserve based on practical utility rather than cultural prestige. The Spanish missionary practice of building churches atop pyramid platforms created physical and symbolic continuities between pre-Columbian and colonial religious practices. Indigenous communities often incorporated pre-Columbian stones into church construction, conducted syncretic rituals that combined Catholic and Maya elements, and maintained sacred sites under the guise of Christian pilgrimage locations. These adaptations, developed during centuries of post-collapse religious transformation, enabled the preservation of core spiritual concepts despite radical changes in institutional religion. The documentation of indigenous land tenure systems during the colonial period reveals organizational principles that likely emerged during the post-collapse period. The emphasis on corporate community ownership rather than individual property rights, the importance of kinship networks in determining access to resources, and the integration of agricultural and forest lands into coherent territorial units all suggest adaptations to the absence of state-level administration. These systems proved remarkably persistent, surviving both the collapse and colonization to influence modern Maya communities. Archaeological evidence from early colonial sites shows material culture that blends pre-Columbian, post-collapse, and European elements in complex ways. Pottery production continued traditional forming techniques while incorporating European vessel forms. House construction combined indigenous techniques with Spanish-introduced tools and materials. Agricultural practices integrated European crops and animals into existing milpa systems. This cultural synthesis, building on centuries of post-collapse adaptation, created distinctive regional traditions that persist in modern Maya communities. The jungle floor of northern Guatemala appeared unremarkable to the naked eye, a tangle of vegetation broken only by the occasional mound that might have been a natural hill, or perhaps the remains of some ancient structure. But when the twin-engine aircraft passed overhead in 2018, its light detection and ranging equipment penetrating the dense canopy with millions of laser pulses per second, the hidden landscape beneath revealed itself in breathtaking detail. Where researchers had expected to find perhaps a few dozen structures, the LiDAR data revealed over 60,000 previously unknown Maya buildings, complete with pyramids, palaces, defensive walls, and agricultural terraces stretching for miles beneath the green carpet of forest. This revolutionary technology has forced archaeologists to completely reconsider their estimates of Maya population density and urban extent. The Mirador-Calakmul karst basin, once thought to contain scattered settlements separated by vast stretches of uninhabited forest, now appears to have been an almost continuous urban landscape connected by raised causeways and defensive earthworks. Population estimates for the region have increased from perhaps 1 million to as many as 15 or even 20 million people at the classic period peak, radically altering our understanding of both the civilization's achievement and the magnitude of its collapse. The LiDAR revelations extend beyond simple structure, counting to reveal the extraordinary sophistication of Maya landscape engineering. Vast networks of canals and wetland modifications show that the Maya had transformed entire watersheds to support intensive agriculture. Agricultural terraces climb slopes that archaeologists had assumed were too steep for cultivation, while complex systems of reservoirs and channels demonstrate water management on a scale previously unimagined. The discovery of extensive defensive systems, including walls, moats, and fortified checkpoints, suggests that warfare during the late Classic period was far more intensive and organized than traditional archaeological surveys had indicated. Perhaps most remarkably, LiDAR has revealed that many supposedly pristine forests in the Maya region are actually anthropogenic landscapes, still bearing the imprint of ancient modification. What appear to be natural hills are revealed as pyramids, straight lines in the forest mark ancient roads, and subtle elevation changes indicate millennia-old agricultural terraces. The technology has detected quarries, workshop areas, and residential zones in places where ground surveys found nothing, demonstrating that the Maya had modified virtually every square meter of their territory during the classic period peak. The isotope revolution in archaeology has provided an entirely different window into the collapse, one that reveals the lived experience of individuals rather than the broad patterns visible in settlement surveys. Strontium isotope analysis of tooth enamel, which preserves the geological signature of where a person spent their childhood, has revealed massive population movements during the collapse period that were invisible to traditional archaeology. Individuals buried at Copán show strontium signatures from regions hundreds of miles away, indicating that the site attracted or captured people from across the Maya world during its final years. Carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of bone collagen has reconstructed ancient diets with remarkable precision, revealing not just what people ate, but how their nutrition changed over time. The bones of individuals who lived through the collapse show dramatic dietary shifts within single lifetimes, with decreased protein consumption and increased reliance on less nutritious foods clearly visible in the isotopic signatures. Children born during the collapse period show evidence of severe nutritional stress that would have caused both physical and cognitive impairment, explaining in part why the civilization could not recover even when environmental conditions eventually improved. Oxygen isotope analysis of tooth enamel has provided crucial evidence for drought timing and intensity by recording the isotopic composition of drinking water consumed during childhood. Teeth from individuals who grew up during the proposed drought periods show enriched oxygen isotope values consistent with increased evaporation and reduced precipitation. The analysis of multiple teeth from the same individuals reveals year-by-year variations in rainfall during their childhood, providing a biological record of climate variability that correlates remarkably well with geological climate proxies. The application of compound-specific isotope analysis to ceramic residues has revealed details about ancient food preparation and consumption that transform our understanding of Maya cuisine and its role in the collapse. Residues from cooking vessels show that the Maya diet was far more diverse than the traditional three sisters of maize, beans, and squash, including a wide variety of wild plants, insects, and small animals that provided crucial micronutrients. The disappearance of many of these foods from the archaeological record during the collapse period suggests that nutritional deficiencies may have been as significant as caloric shortages in driving mortality. Modern climate modeling has moved beyond simple correlation of droughts with collapse to reveal the complex feedback loops between deforestation, local climate change, and agricultural productivity. Computer simulations incorporating archaeological data on the extent and timing of deforestation show that the removal of forest cover would have reduced local precipitation by 10 to 20%, independent of any larger regional climate trends. This anthropogenic climate change would have been particularly severe during the dry season, extending the period of water stress and making agriculture increasingly precarious. The models reveal that deforestation effects were not uniform across the Maya region, but created complex patterns of winners and losers. Areas downwind of large deforested zones would have experienced the most severe precipitation decreases, while regions that maintained forest cover might have actually seen increased rainfall as atmospheric circulation patterns shifted. This heterogeneous climate impact explains in part why some cities collapsed rapidly while others persisted, and why population movements during the collapse followed specific geographic patterns rather than random dispersal. High-resolution climate proxies from speleothems have provided unprecedented detail about the nature of classic period droughts. Uranium series dating combined with stable isotope analysis of cave formations can now resolve climate variations down to individual years or even seasons. These records reveal that the mega-droughts of the classic collapse were not uniform dry periods, but consisted of extreme variability, with occasional severe floods interrupting multi-year droughts. This climatic whiplash would have been particularly destructive to agricultural systems, preventing farmers from adapting to either consistently wet or dry conditions. The discovery of volcanic tephra layers in lake sediments and ice cores has identified previously unknown volcanic eruptions that coincided with periods of social stress in the Maya region. The massive eruption of Ilopango volcano in El Salvador around 540 CE corresponds with a period of reduced monument construction and political upheaval throughout the southern lowlands. More subtle volcanic events, detected only through careful geochemical analysis, may have caused short-term climate perturbations that pushed already stressed agricultural systems past critical thresholds. Genetic analysis of modern Maya populations has revealed surprising patterns of continuity and change since the collapse. Mitochondrial DNA studies show that modern Maya maintain strong genetic links to pre-Columbian populations, with relatively little European or African admixture in rural communities. This genetic continuity extends back through the collapse period, indicating that despite massive population loss and displacement, the Maya people themselves survived and maintained distinct genetic lineages. The pattern of genetic diversity suggests multiple refuge areas where populations weathered the collapse before re-expanding. Y chromosome analysis has revealed interesting patterns of sex-biased population dynamics during and after the collapse. The reduced diversity of male lineages compared to female lineages suggests that male mortality during the collapse period was particularly severe, possibly due to warfare or the abandonment of female-biased populations as men migrated in search of resources. The recovery of populations after the collapse appears to have involved a small number of surviving male lineages expanding rapidly, creating founder effects still visible in modern populations. Ancient DNA extraction from skeletal remains, though challenging in tropical environments where DNA degrades rapidly, has begun to yield insights into population relationships and movements during the collapse. Preliminary results suggest that urban populations were more genetically diverse than previously thought, incorporating people from across Mesoamerica through trade, warfare, and migration. The genetic homogenization visible in post-collapse populations suggests that the mixing of previously distinct groups during the crisis created new genetic patterns that characterize modern Maya populations. Paleomicrobiome analysis of dental calculus and coprolites has revealed the hidden world of ancient gut bacteria and oral pathogens that may have contributed to the collapse. The bacterial communities preserved in these contexts show increasing prevalence of pathogenic species during the late Classic period, suggesting that infectious disease was a more significant factor in the collapse than previously recognized. The discovery of bacterial DNA from pathogens that cause systemic infections provides the first direct evidence for specific diseases that afflicted classic Maya populations. Environmental DNA extracted from lake sediments has revealed changes in the broader ecosystem during the collapse period that were invisible to traditional paleoecological methods. The presence or absence of DNA from various plant and animal species tracks the collapse of forest ecosystems and their gradual recovery with far greater taxonomic precision than pollen analysis alone. The technique has revealed that some economically important species went locally extinct during the collapse and never recovered, permanently altering the resources available to post-collapse populations. Proteomics analysis of preserved organic materials has provided insights into ancient technologies that were crucial for Maya survival. Analysis of residues from ceramic vessels has identified specific proteins from medicinal plants, revealing a sophisticated pharmacological tradition that may have helped populations survive the epidemics of the collapse period. The identification of proteins from psychoactive plants in ritual contexts suggests that altered states of consciousness played important roles in Maya responses to crisis, possibly providing psychological coping mechanisms during social breakdown. Advances in radiocarbon dating, particularly the development of accelerator mass spectrometry, have revolutionized chronological understanding of the collapse. Single seeds or tiny fragments of charcoal can now be dated precisely, allowing archaeologists to track the abandonment of individual structures within sites. The ability to date multiple samples from single contexts has revealed that many sudden abandonments actually occurred over several decades, with different parts of sites abandoned at different times as populations gradually dispersed. Bayesian statistical modeling of radiocarbon dates has revealed temporal patterns in the collapse that were invisible when dates were considered individually. The models show that the collapse proceeded in waves, with periods of rapid abandonment followed by temporary stabilization before the next wave of failures. The geographic pattern of these waves suggests that the collapse spread like a contagion from initial failure points, with the breakdown of each major center triggering cascading failures in dependent communities. Satellite remote sensing has complemented LiDAR by revealing landscape-scale patterns of ancient land use and environmental change. Multispectral imaging can detect subtle differences in vegetation that indicate ancient agricultural fields, revealing that the Maya cultivated marginal lands far more extensively than previously believed. The extent of ancient erosion visible in satellite imagery demonstrates the massive environmental impact of classic period agriculture, with some regions still showing reduced productivity 1,000 years after abandonment. Machine learning algorithms applied to the massive data sets generated by modern archaeological techniques have revealed patterns that human analysts might never have detected. Neural networks trained on ceramic assemblages can now track population movements and cultural interactions with unprecedented precision. Algorithms analyzing settlement patterns have identified previously unrecognized defensive strategies and alliance networks. The application of artificial intelligence to archaeological problems has accelerated the pace of discovery while revealing the true complexity of the collapse process. Experimental archaeology has tested hypotheses about agricultural productivity, construction techniques, and craft production that are crucial for understanding the collapse. Attempts to replicate ancient agricultural yields using traditional techniques have generally produced lower outputs than theoretical models predicted, suggesting that the Maya agricultural system was even more precarious than previously thought. Experiments with water storage in reconstructed reservoirs have revealed how quickly these systems fail without constant maintenance, explaining the rapid collapse of urban water supplies. The integration of all these modern techniques has revealed that the Maya collapse was simultaneously more complex and more catastrophic than earlier generations of archaeologists imagined. The sheer scale of the demographic disaster, with populations falling by 90% or more in some regions, rivals the worst catastrophes in human history. Yet the evidence also reveals remarkable resilience, with populations finding ways to survive and maintain cultural traditions through unimaginable hardship. The collapse was not a mysterious disappearance, but a thoroughly human tragedy of environmental degradation, climate change, political failure, and social breakdown, whose lessons resonate powerfully with contemporary concerns. The parallels between the classic Maya collapse and contemporary global civilization are not merely academic curiosities, but urgent warnings written in stone and soil across the landscapes of Central America. Modern humanity faces the same fundamental challenge that confronted the Maya: how to maintain complex societies within finite ecological limits while climate patterns shift and resources dwindle. The difference lies not in the nature of the problems, but in their scale, with today's interconnected global economy creating vulnerabilities that dwarf even the impressive networks that linked Maya city-states across thousands of square kilometers of challenging terrain. Consider the mathematical reality of exponential growth within bounded systems, a principle the Maya discovered through brutal experience, and that modern civilization seems determined to rediscover. The Maya population grew at roughly 2% annually during their peak centuries, doubling every 35 years until forest soils could no longer sustain the agricultural yields necessary for survival. Today's global population growth has slowed to just over 1%, but consumption per capita rises far faster than population, creating effective growth rates in resource demand that exceed anything the Maya experienced. The planet's forests disappear at rates that would have seemed impossible to Maya farmers who cleared their lands with stone axes and fire. The Maya response to agricultural stress through intensification rather than innovation mirrors contemporary approaches to food production with disturbing precision. Just as Maya farmers shortened fallow periods and cultivated marginal lands rather than developing fundamentally new agricultural systems, modern industrial agriculture responds to rising demand through greater inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and irrigation, rather than addressing the underlying unsustainability of current practices. The phosphorus depletion that contributed to Maya agricultural collapse has its modern parallel in the mining of finite phosphate deposits that industrial agriculture depends upon, with some estimates suggesting these reserves may be exhausted within a century. Climate change during the Maya collapse period, though significant enough to trigger civilizational failure, involved temperature variations of perhaps 1 degree Celsius and regional precipitation changes of 20 to 40%. Contemporary climate projections suggest global temperature increases of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius by century's end, with regional precipitation changes that could exceed 50% in some areas. The Maya faced these changes without understanding their causes or likely progression, while modern civilization proceeds with full knowledge of both the mechanisms and consequences of anthropogenic climate change, yet seems equally unable to mount effective responses. The role of inequality in amplifying the Maya collapse offers particularly relevant lessons for societies experiencing widening wealth gaps. Archaeological evidence reveals that elite hoarding of resources during crisis periods accelerated social breakdown by destroying the reciprocal obligations that had previously provided resilience during temporary hardships. Modern wealth concentration exceeds anything the Maya experienced, with technological leverage allowing individual actors to control resources that would have required entire city-states to amass in classic times. The breakdown of social contracts that occurred during the Maya collapse when elites failed to provide promised prosperity and protection finds echoes in contemporary political instability driven by perceived failures of leadership and institutions. Deforestation in the Maya region created feedback loops that intensified droughts and made recovery impossible once critical thresholds were passed. Modern deforestation in the Amazon basin threatens similar tipping points, with models suggesting that removal of another 10 to 15% of forest cover could trigger irreversible transformation from rainforest to savanna. The Maya lacked the scientific understanding to recognize these thresholds until they had passed them, but contemporary civilization proceeds toward identical precipices with full knowledge of the consequences, suggesting that information alone does not prevent civilizational failures. The Maya belief that their rulers could control rainfall through ritual intervention seems primitive until one considers modern faith in technological solutions to ecological crises. The conviction that geoengineering, carbon capture, or space colonization will rescue humanity from environmental limits represents a similar displacement of practical action onto hoped-for interventions. The Maya at least recognized their dependence on natural cycles, even if they misunderstood the mechanisms, while contemporary discourse often assumes human ingenuity can simply transcend ecological constraints that have governed life on Earth for billions of years. Disease amplification in concentrated Maya urban populations parallels modern pandemic risks in interconnected global cities. The The Maya collapse saw regional epidemics that weakened populations already stressed by malnutrition and environmental degradation. Modern air travel can spread pathogens globally within days, while antibiotic resistance and emerging diseases create vulnerabilities that eclipse anything pre-modern populations faced. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how quickly complex systems can be disrupted by biological threats, yet also showed resilience and adaptive capacity the Maya lacked, suggesting that outcomes are not predetermined even when challenges are severe. Yet focusing solely on parallels risks missing the profound resilience of Maya civilization and its lessons for cultural survival through catastrophe. The Maya did not disappear. They adapted, survived, and maintained cultural continuity through one of history's most severe demographic and social collapses. Today, approximately 7 million Maya speakers maintain linguistic traditions that connect directly to classic period inscriptions. Traditional agricultural practices, religious beliefs, craft techniques, and social organizations persist in forms that would be recognizable to classic period Maya, despite centuries of traumatic disruption. The survival of Maya mathematical concepts, including their vigesimal counting system and sophisticated understanding of zero, in traditional Maya communities, demonstrates how core knowledge can persist even when institutional frameworks collapse. Contemporary Maya daykeepers maintain calendar traditions that preserve essential elements of classic period temporal concepts, though simplified and syncretized with other traditions. These cultural continuities were not preserved through written records or formal institutions, but through oral tradition and daily practice, suggesting that the most resilient knowledge is that which becomes embedded in practical life rather than specialized expertise. The misconception that the Maya mysteriously vanished, popularized by early explorers and perpetuated in popular media, obscures the genuine achievement of cultural survival through catastrophe. The Maya people who guided Spanish conquistadors through vine-covered ruins were not ignorant of their heritage, but had adapted their culture to radically changed circumstances. The emphasis on mysterious disappearance serves contemporary narratives about lost civilizations while ignoring the more complex and instructive reality of adaptation and persistence. The Maya collapse was not an ending, but a transformation, traumatic and destructive, but not final. Modern Maya communities maintain sophisticated traditional ecological knowledge that often surpasses scientific understanding of local ecosystems. Maya farmers can predict weather patterns through observations of plant and animal behavior with accuracy that rivals meteorological forecasts. Traditional Maya agricultural practices, including the milpa system with its complex polycultures and managed forest succession, provide yields comparable to industrial agriculture while maintaining soil fertility indefinitely. These systems, developed through millennia of experience, including the harsh lessons of the collapse period, offer models for sustainable intensification that industrial agriculture has yet to match. The response of contemporary Maya communities to modernization pressures demonstrates active cultural adaptation rather than passive preservation. Maya weavers incorporate modern materials and designs while maintaining traditional techniques and symbolic systems. Maya political movements assert indigenous rights using both traditional governance concepts and contemporary legal frameworks. The syncretic religions practiced in Maya communities blend pre-Columbian, colonial Catholic, and modern evangelical elements in dynamic combinations that serve current spiritual needs while maintaining ancient cosmological concepts. Archaeological tourism at sites like Tikal, Chichen Itza, and Palenque creates complex relationships between contemporary Maya peoples and their ancestral heritage. Local Maya communities often find themselves excluded from economic benefits, while their cultural traditions are commodified for tourist consumption. Yet many Maya individuals have become advocates for site preservation and interpretation, using tourism as a platform to correct misconceptions and assert continuing connections to these places. The ruins serve simultaneously as sources of income, cultural pride, and political leverage in struggles for indigenous rights. The role of Maya communities in protecting forest ecosystems demonstrates how traditional management practices developed through the collapse experience remain relevant to contemporary conservation. Maya forest gardens maintain higher biodiversity than protected reserves while providing sustainable livelihoods for local communities. Traditional fire management practices that prevented the catastrophic burns that can destroy tropical forest soils offer alternatives to both fire suppression and uncontrolled burning. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern conservation science creates more effective and equitable environmental protection than either approach alone. The linguistic diversity of contemporary Mayan languages, with 31 distinct languages spoken across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, represents successful adaptation to regional variations rather than fragmentation from a unified original. Each language maintains unique perspectives and knowledge encoded in vocabulary, grammar, and metaphor that would be lost if linguistic diversity disappeared. The preservation of these languages against centuries of pressure to adopt Spanish demonstrates remarkable cultural resilience, while their ongoing evolution shows that tradition need not mean stagnation. Educational initiatives led by Maya scholars to teach hieroglyphic writing to contemporary Maya youth represent attempts to reconnect with aspects of heritage lost during the collapse. These programs do not seek to recreate classic period culture, but to provide contemporary Maya with access to their historical texts and the ability to engage with archaeological interpretations of their past. The recovery of literacy in ancestral scripts, even if partial and modernized, reverses one of the most profound losses of the collapse period, while demonstrating that cultural recovery remains possible centuries after disruption. The legal struggles of Maya communities to protect sacred sites and assert land rights often invoke both the antiquity of occupation, demonstrated by archaeological sites, and the continuity of cultural practices that link contemporary peoples to ancient inhabitants. These claims challenge Western notions of property and heritage, while asserting indigenous frameworks for understanding relationships between people, land, and history. The success or failure of these struggles will partly determine whether Maya culture continues as a living tradition or becomes relegated to museums and tourist sites. Climate change impacts on contemporary Maya communities, including increased drought frequency, extreme weather events, and shifting agricultural zones, echo the challenges that triggered the classic collapse. Yet modern Maya farmers demonstrate remarkable adaptability, modifying traditional practices to accommodate changing conditions while maintaining core principles of diversity and sustainability. The experience of surviving previous climate catastrophes provides both practical knowledge and psychological resilience that industrialized populations often lack. Maya communities know from historical experience that civilizations can collapse, but people can survive. The participation of Maya individuals in global indigenous movements connects local struggles to worldwide efforts to protect traditional cultures and ecosystems. Maya activists contribute perspectives shaped by the collapse experience to discussions of sustainability, resilience, and environmental justice. The recognition that the classic Maya created one of humanity's great civilizations yet failed to sustain it provides moral authority in arguing for alternative development models that prioritize longevity over growth. International collaborations between Maya communities and archaeological projects increasingly recognize indigenous peoples not as subjects of study, but as partners in research. Community archaeology programs train local Maya youth in excavation and analysis techniques while incorporating traditional knowledge into interpretations. These collaborations challenge colonial models of archaeology while producing richer understandings that combine scientific and traditional perspectives. The involvement of descendant communities in decisions about site management and artifact disposition asserts continuing connections between living peoples and ancient places. The lessons of the Maya collapse ultimately concern not the inevitability of failure, but the possibilities for both catastrophe and survival that complex societies create. The Maya achieved extraordinary accomplishments in art, science, architecture, and social organization that rival any human civilization, yet could not resolve the fundamental tension between growth and sustainability. Their failure was not mysterious, but resulted from comprehensible interactions between environmental degradation, climate change, political dysfunction, and social inequality that remain relevant challenges today. The resilience demonstrated by Maya peoples through both the classic collapse and subsequent catastrophes of colonization and modernization offers hope that human cultures can survive even severe disruptions. The maintenance of language, belief, practice, and identity through centuries of pressure demonstrates that cultural essence can persist even when institutional structures disappear. The Maya story is not one of disappearance but of transformation, not of ending but of continuity through change. Modern civilization stands at a junction similar to that faced by the classic Maya at their height, possessed of unprecedented knowledge and power, yet seemingly unable to alter trajectories that lead toward predictable crises. The Maya collapse demonstrates that sophisticated civilizations can fail catastrophically when they exceed environmental limits and lose social cohesion. But Maya survival equally demonstrates that human communities can adapt and persist through even severe disruptions. The question is not whether modern civilization will face challenges comparable to those that felled the classic Maya, but whether humanity will respond with the wisdom to prevent collapse or the resilience to survive it. The ruins that tower above the forest canopy throughout the Maya region stand not as monuments to mysterious disappearance, but as testaments to both human achievement and human limitation. They remind us that civilizations are not permanent fixtures, but temporary arrangements that must constantly be renewed through conscious effort and adaptation. The Maya who built these cities created wonders that still inspire awe, while making mistakes that led to catastrophe. Their descendants survived that catastrophe and maintained cultural traditions that connect past and present across 1,000 years of change. In their story lies both warning and hope for a world facing its own moment of critical decision between transformation and collapse.